last month we talked about protect people, and we had some wonderful folks on. If you want to see the recording of that, feel free to let us know. And this tonight we're focused on disrupt and disobey. And this area is looking at how do we go beyond protesting for better policies and into the territory of people intervening to stop bad policies or to show resistance. Um, I'm quoting from the article if that was not obvious. In effect, disrupt and disobey type actions are in those effective actions, the ultimate goal is paving a path for mass non-cooperation, tax resistance, national strikes, work shutdowns, and other nonviolent mass disobedience tactics, which are the most effective strategies in displacing authoritarians. So I'm going to introduce the folks that we have that are joining us tonight. We have Ajamu Umi, a longtime movement partner and advisor and strategist with us. Ajamu is an organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party, and many of you may have seen his de-escalation and safety organizing trainings that we've shared out many, many times. He's going to be doing a safety training after we have this conversation, a shortened version. We're really grateful to have Ajamu here. And then Daniel Hunter, as I mentioned, the author of this article, 10 Ways to Be Prepared and Grounded Now That Trump Has Won. Daniel is working currently based at Choose Democracy and is an international trainer of organizers. And then our beloved Cara Shelt, organizer and former co-director at ROP, currently supporting our team part-time while raising a future movement leader. So if these folks want to come to the front, we're going to kick things off just alphabetically to make it simple. And then I invite the three of you to jump in and say, wait, can you say more about that? Or you forgot this part of that story that I've heard this other part of that story, and let's bring that in. So we want it to be conversational, but just to get folks started, Ajamu, could you start just any introduction that you want to provide that I didn't share already, and then jump in with how you would like to respond to the question of what is a historic or global movement story about people disrupting and or disobeying that inspires you in your organizing?
Yeah, welcome. Thank you all. I've been at work all day. I've been saying welcome to people, so apologize for that. But good to see everybody. Absolutely, I think that the question of the last part that you raised about, what is the inspiration? I mean, a whole lot of stuff inspires me, you all. I mean, I come from a place where I learned at a very early age that oppression breeds resistance. And I was one of those people that was taught early on that if you don't stand up and fight for your rights, you won't have them. So I think that any little thing that is reflective of that spirit is something that we can build on, no matter what it is. So really excited to do that. I forgot, what was the first part again, Emma? Sorry.
If you could share a story from a movement you've been a part of, or one that you've studied in history or across the globe of people successfully disrupting or disobeying.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, Ajamu, your sound is a little bit choppy. I'm not sure if there's something covering your mic or anything we can do.
There is something I can do. After I finish, I think I'll just change computers because I mean, it's always something. But yeah, thank you for telling me that. Sorry about that. But yeah, I think that the best quick story I can give you all is that a lot of the work that I'm involved in is centered around a lot of what you have to deal with in Oregon with the intolerant elements. So I think in a number of instances, I've been able to participate in work that's designed to help people build their capacity to protect their communities, right? I've done so much of that that I even was able to write a book about it, and people use that and study it. And it's all about, like, how do we empower ourselves? I believe that Our ability to be safe comes from us. Our ability to build societies that respect everybody and appreciate everybody's existence and contribution to them comes from people that are in these conversations right here. I don't think they come from institutions or elected people. I think if they do come from those things, it's only because we force it to come from those things. So I think that's where my inspiration comes from. And I think that's where I would think that most of us would get our inspiration.
Thanks so much.
I'll be right back.
Cara, you're up next. If you have any other intro you'd want to give, please share it. And then what is a historic or global movement story about people disrupting and disobeying that inspires you?
Yeah. Well, I just want to say I'm really thrilled to be here, and I have a long history with ROP, starting back in 2002 when I first came on staff as an organizer, working with Marcy Westerling, ROP's founder. And I am so happy to be back hanging with ROP. It's been about 5 years that I was gone until I came back again recently. And it's, I would speak a little bit to what Ajamu said about how my inspiration comes right now from the fact that there are like 90 fucking human dignity groups around the state and 35 of Oregon's 36 counties of people self-organizing, led by volunteers, which is deeply rare, unfortunately, in this country. And there's many places with incredible organizing. So that's not to undervalue that there is an incredible organizing going on, but this is something that is so powerful, and the possibility of coming together and doing things as well as what we can do in our own hometowns and counties is really something that gives me inspiration in this moment when it can feel daunting. The other piece that gives me inspiration is like remembering our connection to movement history. I feel that sometimes in the Northwest, we don't always tell our movement stories or tell our movement history the way that we should, because there's so much that has happened in the 3+ decades of ROP's existence and the human dignity groups in the Northwest. And that I think we can really draw from. Right now is the 25th anniversary of we just hit the 25th anniversary of the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle. And I can speak more to it throughout this call of where it's of value. But I would say that was, for me, that was one transformative, because that was the place for me where I learned more about organizing and mobilizing, and learned that I wanted to be an organizer. And I didn't even know what it was. And people were like, I was like, I want to do this thing. And people were like, that's organizing. And it was a few years later that I actually found ROP and started doing my organizing with ROP. And then it's been my movement home ever since, over 20 years. So, but one of the things that I think is really powerful about the organizing that happened in Seattle, so this was 1999. I'm going to give just a tiny bit of context to make sure everybody is sort of tracking, but the World Trade Organization, basically a global institution that was making decisions about trade law and other things that would impose these laws basically on countries, even if it went against their own like climate legislation, their own worker policies, their own trade policies, et cetera. And folks organized in response they were having the ministerial meetings in November 1999 in Seattle, and folks organized in response. The call was to shut down the WTO. No one actually believed that the WTO was going to be shut down. And then it was like fucking shut down. And it was a very powerful moment to be a part of, and several days to be a part of, linked to a global movement where these actions were happening all over the globe in response to the World Trade Organization. But it was incredible. I'm going to show you a picture with my camera, where the Direct Action Network was one of the main organizers for the direct action. There was a lot of other folks and organizations involved in lots of actions happening in Seattle, but they had basically, like, this is the map that the Direct Action Network made. That is, you can't tell, but the dark spot is where they were meeting. And then there's lines going out where they broke the entire city around it into pie slices. And then Affinity Groups actually claimed a pie slice to take over the streets in that pie slice in order to try and shut down the city to prevent the meeting for the WTO for happening. And so there was like, and they were made by letters, and one of them was like key lime slice, and there were like radios at the Direct Action Network warehouse that was like communicating where the police were and like telling people where to move to, and it was literally all volunteer affinity groups that just like were networked through this network that then, by taking a slice of the city, actually like shut down the city and then shut down the World Trade Organization meetings. And this is that map, by the way, is from this book, The Battle of Seattle, the story of the Battle of Seattle. There's also some films you can see about it too. But that was for me an incredibly powerful moment where there was huge police repression and response, but also like people doing it and actually like going out in intersections in front of buses. And it was all just like regular people doing it, but deeply organized and connected to like effectively shut down this global like institution that was wreaking havoc on climate justice, immigrant rights, worker rights, etc. So that's a moment of like disrupt and disobey that was transformative for me and also powerful to be part of, and part of our movement history here in the Northwest.
Thanks so much. Daniel, pass it to you.
Great, thanks. Cara's there in Seattle with you during that. So delightful. I thought you looked familiar. But I think one of the when I was preparing to write the article, one of the things I spent a bunch of time doing was learning from other movements outside of the US about how they handled authoritarianism. And one just really sticks with me, which is the story of Otpor in Serbia. And so Otpor is a resistance movement against the dictator Milosevic. And they had actually tried to kick him out years earlier and had been unsuccessful. They tried a kind of mix of violent and nonviolent tactics and tried a bunch of street battles. And it really strengthened Milosevic's hand. He knows how to handle violence to violence. So they decide to get a second round, and they organized primarily among young people. And so similar to your story, Cara, they organized through very decentralized networks. So it wasn't the case where people felt, for the most part, that they were part of they didn't get to see everybody. It was a security tactic in part to make it hard to disrupt and interfere with. But they organized decentrally. They did lots of trainings. And initially, a lot of their disruption was simply disrupting the narrative, the story. People didn't want to speak out. There's so much fear because he had been such a stranglehold. And so they were just expanding the political space. So they would do these like funny things. At one point, they got accused of being terrorists. And so they organized a terrorist fashion show in the downtown center city. And they organized a terrorist fashion show where they, would say, look at Emma there with a hat backwards, and, look at Ajamu, who clearly is like terrorists clearly wear glasses and because they're readers, that kind of thing. And so they just played with it. So humor, a lot of humor. And then they really effectively targeted what are the different pillars, what are the different institutions that are supporting Milosevic's support. And so they began targeting. So one of the big things they targeted was the army and the police. And they just wore them down. I mean, they got beat up regularly by police. And so it was very common that they would go in the streets and do a protest or a rally or something, and police would come and brutalize them. So they began targeting some of the most brutal folks in the police. And their strategy was this, which was they would go to the houses. They'd look up like this person, the police officers really beating us up a lot. So they'd go to the house with the people who had just been beaten up, with signs, sometimes pictures even blown up of their faces or whatever, cuts, lacerations. And their frame was very careful, which was, it wasn't an attack on, it was an invitation to, and said, you will get a chance to join us. You too will get a chance to join us in the future. And they especially were targeting the neighbors because their belief was if there became kind of peer pressure on these police, do you really know that this is what they're up to over here? And they really need to get in line. They need to get a chance. So they continue to do that. And they would escalate, just to let you know, they would escalate where if, for example, some of the folks who kept being the worst of, they would then escalate and go to the police officer's kids' school again, with these pictures of themselves as they were beaten up and so on. And they would go to the school and say, this is what your dad is up to. This is what your mom is up to. And they're going to get a chance to join us. And so that was they did lots of disruption like that along the way. And the invitation was always there. You can do better. They used to joke with their spies that were in their offices. They would say, they would find out who's a spy. And they would say, you're going to get a chance to join us. Don't worry. You'll get your opportunity. And they were foreseeing the future where eventually they did a massive action where they did, after an election was stolen very openly, brazenly, and they caught them doing it. They had tons of people, similar to Battle of Seattle, where they had tons of people go down to the Capitol and actually physically take over the building and to release it to the people. And at that moment, the police and the military were given orders to shoot into the crowds, and they did not. They defied them. And so that doesn't come about just because you've created a narrative. It comes about because you've invited them specifically over and over and over and over again and created the story and created the energy and done your timing. They were very careful on their timing for when they would do that. So the escalation, I think a lot of the different pieces there of strategy are in that story.
Thank you for that. I also saw a comment in the chat about the occupation of Greg Walden's district offices, which is something that many RO peers were part of over 10 years ago now. It's been a long time. That's the former U.S. representative from Eastern Oregon, Greg Walden. Ajamu, we're glad to have you back. You want to do a mic check?
Yeah, hopefully it's a lot better now.
Yes.
Oh, beautiful. Coming through so well. Awesome. Thanks for problem solving in the moment. Great. Well, I will open this next question up to whoever wants to kick it off. Often we talk about disruption or disobedience at the large scale, like shut down WTO, or this happened all over the country. And Daniel, in your story, like we're just going to this one police officer's house. I could imagine for folks here, you go to one police officer's house in your area, and you might not feel like you're part of like a really big movement, especially in the first or second one. So I'm curious, what ways or how do folks effectively employ disruption and disobedience at a smaller scale, at that local level? And where can we each decide to disrupt or disobey?
I mean, if I can, I'll just say that I think as a tactic, disruption has to be carried out in increments because most people are not accustomed to engaging in disruptive behavior. Like for someone like me, that's the order of the day, but for most people it isn't. So, I work for a labor union, for example, and the way that we do this, which is very effective, is a lot of people say, well, I'm ready to strike. But what I always tell them is that we can't even get you to come to a contract campaign action. So it's hard for us to believe that you're ready to strike. So instead of us jumping from 0 to 60, let's do this. Let's first have a day where you talk to people in your work site and you say, hey, everybody's going to wear a certain color, purple.
Yeah.
Do that. And then the next time, let's talk about everybody wearing a sticker that has a statement on it, like respect workers or, support immigration or whatever it is. Just a simple message. Everybody do that. And let's see how that goes. And then once we do that, then the next step is let's have an informational picket where people just stand on the corner and they have a sign that has a message. And meanwhile, what's happening through all these steps is people are seeing the reaction to these very low-level actions that they're engaging in, and they're seeing people's response, and they're feeling empowered because they're able to, experience like, hey, people are noticing this. This is good. So this is how you build up to getting people to the point where they will be willing to strike. So I think that on any level, no matter where you are, even like in rural areas, it's a lot of times difficult, I know, to step out there and have public actions because of the environments that you're in. But I think that, there are all types of things that can happen in a small community to deliver a message. You know, you can engage in actions in the night. You can put up signs all over the place in the nighttime. You can do all types of things to make it clear that people want to assert this message and people are willing to engage in things. You can have boycotts. You know, boycotts are great because you can organize people to carry out an act and they can be basically anonymous. But the point is clear, right? Like if you have something that like if you have a sick out, like people call in sick at work and the kids are sick and don't go to school, that's something that can be done. It's very difficult to prove that, you know, you're doing it for any other reason other than you're actually ill. But if enough people do that, if the organization is tight enough and enough people can do that in response to something, it sends a pretty clear message that, look, we got all these people that are really tired of what's happening. And I'll give you a quick example before I shut up. In 1995, I was fortunate enough, our organization was fortunate enough to participate in helping organize the Million Man March. I'm sure people remember that. And it's not that, you know, we had a lot of issues with a lot of the rhetoric that was coming from the platform of the people organizing the march, but we did see it as an opportunity because there are millions of people excited about it. So we were focused on those millions of people, not just any one man or anybody else. So one of the things we were able to bring to that process through our on the ground organizing work is that the official slogan of the Million Man March, if you look it up, was reconciliation and atonement. And we don't feel like we had anything to reconcile or atone for. We wanted to have a much more militant element to the march. So we were the ones that imposed the National Day of Absence. If you look at the history from 1995, nobody goes to work, nobody goes to school, none of that, as a form of protest on that day. And as a result, we had, according to the Department of Labor, about 700,000 people called in sick that day. And, you know, what they do, they compared to how many people call in sick on any given Monday. And it was, you know, it was a vast difference from what it generally is. And so they, not us, they credited it to the Million Man March. And the media was talking about it. If you go back on YouTube and look at the videos, people were talking about, like, you know, and there were jokes. You know, there are a lot of jokes people made, like, you know, how many people missed work on the day of the Million Man March? None. You know, implying that as African people we don't work. But the message was clear, despite the humor, that the powers that be were concerned about this because it demonstrated to them that a simple organizing effort could get almost 1 million people to do something in the flash of a moment. So these types, they have no way of knowing who didn't. They can't track all the people that didn't go to work. You know, they don't have the capacity to do that. But it was an effective organizing tool. So there are a lot of things that we could do to be extremely disruptive in ways that allow us to maintain our, you know, who we are in the communities we live in, but send a clear message that we're not going to stand for whatever it is that's going on.
I just want to pick up where you went there, which is, I think your opening line where you said oppression breeds resistance is absolutely right and really critical for us to like just really take that in this moment, because I think a lot of the lines that we've had in the past are going to be shifting. There's going to be new, like, you know, those of us who I grew up in a small town and there's just 5 people who always did the organizing. You know, it was Lonnie Valentine and Jody English. We just got used to that. And I think this time there will be some shifting in that. I think what we're about to experience and what we're experiencing now, there's shifting lines of allegiances and alliances that are available. So I think you're absolutely right, which is right now it's a lot of smaller actions. That's the way we kind of begin building up. And so I think this isn't, I think for most of us, we're not in a place where we like run ourselves into the gears of the system per se, as much as we look around for what are some alliances that we might move. So I said I was in the great state of New Jersey. So in the great state of New Jersey, folks have this group called the Visibility Project began putting up just signs saying Musk stole your tax data. I just pasted it into the chat. and showing it up on signs. Highly replicable, very easy, chance to do just kind of marking the political moment and helping people out on what's going on. And I think those are easy disruption activities that folks may participate in. There's actions like people have been doing jamming hotlines. So people have been jamming, there's a DEI snitch line that got set up. And so people just started signing it up to hundreds and thousands of different emails and they put it on Democratic. The worst possible pain point you could do, which is you put them on the list of your local Democratic Party. So they get 10,000 emails every day. You know what I mean? So, or they've been jamming ICE hotlines. So folks in different communities have been jamming ICE hotlines as a way to interfere and slow down. Often giving false information or information that leads to people who are not at risk. Or I think another example of just disruption is people making very clear we're not going along with various policies, even if they might not yet trickle to us. So librarians who've been coming out saying we will not actually engage in banning books based on any sort of said policy. That's not going to happen at this library. My library in my town happened to be so bold that they went ahead and made a whole section called Ban Books and put it at the front entrance for everyone to see as a signal to where they stand. So those are signifiers that help us as we move towards these bigger actions of strikes and so forth that I think we'll get to, but we're not there at this moment. That's not my read. Instead, I think we're much more about sort of building new alliances and allegiances. So those are examples that occur to me in this moment that I've been seeing around town.
I love those examples. They're so good. And I would also say, thinking about, the librarians and the people who do those things, how important it is for us to flank them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at times they might be people that are like, we don't, across the board, we don't agree on everything. Librarians are awesome. They almost always are like the first, and it's incredible. But I think that there will be times where there are people in our towns who are actually like not going to agree, or not, elected officials or others, and that and when they push back and they say, no, we're not going to actually collaborate with ICE, or no, we're not going to do this, that how important it is for us to flank them and to bring them in or engage, because I think those folks will be ones that get picked off, right? And so how doing that is such a key part of it. And I we've been talking a little bit about some of the Greg Walden sit-in stuff, and I want to tell briefly the story of the Cost of War campaign, and then the sit-in in 2000, I think it was 2007, in Greg Walden's office. And basically ROP came together. This is the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the groups across ROP came together and organized the Cost of War campaign. So we did all these visibility actions in communities about what the cost of the war was, both in lives and in the US and in Iraq and Afghanistan. Also the cost of the amount of money that was being spent when our libraries were falling apart and our schools were getting shut down, and how much money was going out of our counties to fund these wars. And then did these cost of war town halls in all the rural congressional districts. We did 4 town halls where we spoke out about the cost of war, not at home and abroad, so the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also the attacks on immigrants happening in the US. And people testified from every county in the district, and 3 of the 4 offices, congressional district offices, sent a representative, because we bugged them to hear the Cost of War town hall, except for Greg Walden's district 2. And so then a group of grandmas kept trying to set a meeting with Greg Walden to talk to him about what happened at the Cost of War town hall, to have a conversation about the war appropriations for Iraq and Afghanistan. And he refused to meet with them, and refused to meet with them, and refused to meet with them. And so they finally, the day before the war appropriations vote, went and sat in his office in Bend, and it was 8 grandmas. Maybe some of them were on here, I'm not sure. Some of them were on our first call that we did. And sat in his office and refused to leave. And they did this buildup in the story of what they did, and to the point where the local reporter on the news was like, these grandmas did everything right, even as they're being like handcuffed and walked out of Greg Walden's office, because they could tell the story of the buildup of what they did in trying to engage Greg Walden in just in conversation. And so I think that there's been moments in our own like history as rural human dignity groups of how we've come together and pushed back at larger systems and the ways that they're moving, and used our relationships in our own communities and across counties to then have like a larger actions, and also do it in a way where we can really tell a story that's like, actually this makes sense, especially when it's like a school teacher and a mayor and a county commissioner testifying about the needs our counties need, and while there's being the funding, the money's going out of the county to fund the wars abroad and etc. So there's probably a ton more to say on that, but that's just like one of the campaigns where I've seen us like collectively really push back and do it in a way that we can tell a really good story.
One thing you just reminded me of, Cara, is my favorite structure for doing disruption, which is if this, then that. And so after, inspired by the WTO protests, there's a group in Quebec and Montreal who were faced with another round of meetings. It was called the DFA, the Department, oh, what was it? It was the FTAA, another free trade agreement. But it was being negotiated in secret, similar to Musk's operation. The whole thing was secret. Fortune 500 companies could get access to it, but no unions could, and no civil society. So they decided to expose it by creating a if this, then that, which is we want you to release all of the negotiating texts for this massive agreement that would go for all of the American countries except for Cuba, North and South. We're all negotiating except for Cuba. And we want you to release all these texts by some date, April 1st or something, I think was a date. And if you don't, then we'll have to release it ourselves through a nonviolent search and seizure operation. And so they announced it, had many months to organize, plan, get people organized around coordinating, et cetera, et cetera. And then they did their nonviolent search and seizure, which was where they attempted to go and liberate the text. And it's a great film about them and about the action itself, but it became a defining moment in the whole thing because it pierced the veil that people were saying, well, they're going to negotiate on our behalf. And so for people who are still holdouts, they began to break because they said, well, if you're not even willing to be transparent about the text itself, how bad could it be? So operating on this thing of transparency was a way to do it. And I keep thinking actually as sitting here, like how we could do that around Musk or so forth. But in any case, that framing of if you don't do this reasonable thing, then we'll be forced to do our disruption, often as a way to kind of soften the disruption blow, or actually better said, to organize around it, to use as a chance. So it's an organizing opportunity rather than it just comes out of the blue.
So, I want to move to how we're assessing risk in moments like this. And know many folks that I'm working with these days are trying to figure out what safety looks like, and we're going to be doing a more specific safety training from Ajamu in the second half of this call. But I know some folks have thrown out tax resistance or other kind of, Ajamu was saying, like, I'm ready to strike, but are you actually ready? Like, is it in your body? Are you prepared to do that level of disruption? So would love for y'all to speak to, for group leaders that are on this call, how would you go about, or what conversations might you want to have with your group about assessing risk for a variety of kind of disruption tactics?
For that, what's essential, there are a couple of things that are really essential. One is that there has to be what I call an inoculation conversation, right? So, because what typically happens is people are, I'm sick of this, something needs to change. We need to do, how come nobody's doing anything about this? And that's great. You know, that's energy, positive energy that can be harnessed. But along with that, there has to be a grounding conversation that is centered around, okay, first, what do we want to do? What are people willing to do? more importantly? What are people willing to do? Because you all know, you've all been in the meetings where everybody has all the great ideas about what needs to happen, and then it gets to the part of the agenda where assignments need to be distributed, and then it's crickets, right? So, how is something going to happen? And who are you expecting to do all this if you're not willing to do it? So we have to answer that question. We have to take time to go around and ask that question. What are people willing to do? And then once we have that and we determine that there are enough people that truly want to do something, then that's where the inoculation question comes in, where we talk about this is the reality of what we could be faced with, right? If we do what we're talking about doing. And it has to be an honest conversation. I know, like, all of you that have been around, that I've had the privilege of working with ROP over the years, like in the many things we've done, we've always had those very honest conversations. Like there could be people hurt in this environment. What is our plan and strategy to try to mitigate the possibility of that happening? And I think that way, if you have that type of conversation, it helps people get mentally and spiritually prepared. And it really, I think, is really cathartic in terms of helping people, because I think that all the emotions that we all have, the excitement, the hope, the enthusiasm, and the fear, all of that is valid, right? And I think part of that process is being able to navigate through that and not try to pretend that the fear doesn't exist, but get to the point where we can work through it without it stopping us from doing what we want to do. And so that conversation helps us do that. Like, it helps us be able to facilitate a process where all of us can take a deep breath and say, okay, I know what I'm getting into, and I'm either ready to approach that or I'm not. And if people decide they're not, that is not a crime. You really want to know that up front instead of when you're in the moment, so that's not a problem if people say that. That's exactly what you want. But for those who get to the point where they're like, yeah, I'm ready to do this, and they know all the risks, then what that tells you is that you have somebody that's going to be there through thick and thin. So I think those are critical steps that have to be taken when we're talking about doing the things we're talking about.
And you hit the nail on the head. No one has anything to add?
I think the only other piece that, I would say call up ROP and have a conversation, because there's so many layers to it, right? Making sure that we've learned so much over the years of how to implement safety and security into our organizing and what we're doing. There's so many ways to think through it. It includes not only who do we have and what roles will they play, but I think in rural communities especially, how many people do we have, right? If it's one or two or three of us taking a risk and that's it, it's right. It's it makes a big difference if we have certain people taking a risk, but hundreds of people that are a part of our groups, even if they're not showing up to everything, but they're they're on our database. They're show up every once in a while. They're our friends, so I think that there's that thinking through of what do we need in order, if we're taking these risks at home in a rural or small community, and how many people do we need? What are the different strategies we need in place? I'm call up ROP and talk it through. But then there's also the really important pieces around, the roles. One thing I feel I learned starting actually at the WTO protest, but ever since, is that there are certain roles about who are going to be the people at home on call to jump into action for whatever unexpected thing happens. Who are going to be the people? There's just so many. We had jail support people for the WTO protests, right? Making sure that there was someone who could be called for the people who were arrested. So there's just a lot of different, really thinking through some of those pieces that I think, in my experiences around the lessons. And then I know a lot of people on this call have even more, I would think, to share around the work that's been happening. But
We need to transition in a moment to the next chunk of this, but this has been so juicy. Daniel, I'm wondering if you want to chat, just share a little bit about the work y'all are prepping around tax resistance, because I know I saw an email from your group about what that's looking like, and could you share just a minute or two about that?
Yeah, so a bunch of people in our network, our little circle over at Choose Democracy, had expressed interest in tax resistance, which we couldn't actually find a case outside of really the US with the Boston Tea Party of examples of folks who've really focused on taxation and been able to do tax resistance as a way to take out an autocrat. But we were fascinated by the tactic and people are interested in learning more about it. So we've decided to just accede to you follow the will of the people. And so we've decided to just give people a chance to explore tax resistance as a strategy. People have been doing war tax resistance as a kind of personal thing, but I think our vision for it would be something a little bit more public as a strategy of essentially, if Trump's a king, we don't give money to kings. It's just not what we do, and therefore we would want to redirect that money to the funds, the places where it really should go, to NIH, to make sure that Medicare is still in operation, to make sure that Head Start still works, et cetera, et cetera. So it would redirect money accordingly. So I'll paste in a second just the link to sign up if you happen to be interested or thinking about being interested in that. It's not public yet. I was going to email it out tomorrow, but you all be first out on that particular operation.
Awesome, thank you. And I just want to uplift some real victories we've seen last week. Coos County's single insurrectionist county commissioner, who was at the insurrection at the Capitol. He is on the Coos County Commission. I don't know if there's Coos Countyers on the phone here, but he put forward a resolution to explicitly defy Oregon's Sanctuary Promise Act, our sanctuary state policy, and say that Coos County is enthusiastically willing to support ICE. And he was voted out, not voted out of office, unfortunately, yet, but he was voted against, and the community came together and said, nope, that's not us. That's not what we want to see. And they are still in alignment with, or they've voted to stay in alignment with the Sanctuary Promise Act. Whether or not their local policies reflect that is another question. But that was a real successful example at the county level that we just saw last week. And there's so many more that we could mention that we're seeing. But as you all are working on disrupting fascist encroachment in your areas, please send us your stories. We want to be uplifting successful work and also unsuccessful work. We're going to learn from our mistakes and hopefully fail forward and continue supporting one another and connecting around the state.